Hello, and welcome to The Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation about how to deliver software better and faster.
If you're looking to build a trusted ship, tune in, let's confidently commit.
Listening to episode 14 of season 2, I'm your host, Rob Zuber, CTO of CircleCI, the industry leader for all things CI and CD. And today, I'm joined by Aniel Sud, CTO of Optimizely. Aniel, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Rob. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. I'm super excited. As I was just saying, I've been an Optimizely customer on and off for a very long time. I was going to name a number of years, but then I realized that would probably predate the company or something ridiculous like that. But it feels like it's been quite a long time. We talk a lot on this show about hypotheses, I guess, and trying things, learning, experimenting, and it feels to me like Optimizely has always been at the core of that kind of mentality. So I'm just excited to hear, how you think about that, how your customers think about it, all of it. So super cool to have you. But to kick things off, can you give us just a little bit of an intro, both to yourself and your role at Optimizely, but also I know that Optimizely went through an acquisition recently and then, has carried forward that brand. So I'm a little, interested to hear just a little bit of that story and what the broader picture is of kind of, Optimizely's offering now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you were mentioning that you didn't want to date yourself prior to the start of the company or something, but Optimizely is it's a name brand basically in experimentation. I think the origin story is basically during the Obama administration. The first one. Optimizely was used to experiment on the website and kind of provide real-time uplift analytics to really optimize the experience. So there's a huge amount of pedigree there. As you say, though, we've gone through a bunch of acquisitions. So I was actually originally with Episerver, who is a DXP company, and Episerver acquired Optimizely a couple of years back, and so we use that to strengthen our overall position as a digital experience provider company. So, everybody knows Optimizely for the experimentation business, but for the past couple of years, been rolling out feature flags and other things in the direction of experimentation. But we've also got, CMS and commerce and customer data platform and, the whole suite of products that help a marketer to really maximize their return with minimal effort, which I think is the name of the game across the board, right?
Yes. And I think for me, like when we think about experimentation, and I end up talking a lot about failure, but then how we use the word failure or failing, like failing is just, we had a hypothesis and it was wrong, but that was the whole point, was to test something and figure out, okay, we know that's wrong. What's right? Like, how do we get onto the right path and maximize, right? How do we maximize our return and how fast can we do that? Like, how simply can we validate or invalidate a particular path and pick a different path and keep going? So, I love the whole experimentation space. It's probably obvious. I'm like giddy with enthusiasm just starting to talk about it, but I'm super curious, like, as someone who offers that tool, how do you see that land in the market, right? Like I often have to remind myself that I live in a little bit of a bubble. I work, CI, CD platform, sort of cutting edge in terms of how people deliver software. Our customers are on the forefront. But when you look at the overall market and talk to folks about, let's put out something that is probably going to be wrong and see how customers react to it, and then put out something else that's probably going to be wrong, and then eventually get to something right. Like, is that a journey that you have to take your customers on? Or do you feel like the customers are really, they totally get it and they're like, yeah, just give me the tool. I know exactly what it is I'm trying to do. Like, let me at it.
No, it's super, super interesting and a very cogent question. I think that, there are customers out there. Experimentation has been around for a really long time, especially in the business context. And there are customers out there that already have it. They're mature on this scale, but there are a lot of customers that are, beginning their journey, and they know that they want to optimize their returns. They know that they want to improve their time to value and all of these things. But you made a very specific call out, which is that, a failed experiment is not one in which you don't get the desired outcome. A failed experiment is one in which you don't learn anything. And that's sort of zeroing in on what is the definition of failure and how do you build the program around it to really drive towards maximizing the conversation with your customer. That's what it comes down to, is how do you glean the most insight you can from each interaction. And that is the outcome that you're driving towards. And a negative result is super enlightening. If you have got a negative correlation, that's still a correlation and gives you something to go on. The worst is when you don't have that active conversation with the customer and you don't know how to influence the outcomes.
Hmm. Hmm. Got it. Uh, I'm having this little flashback in my. I probably meant whatever. For listeners who don't know, I studied engineering physics, and I actually had a lab class for a semester called Design of Experiments, and it was literally, I mean, in a very different space. We were not testing marketing ideas or whatever, but um, really shaping your thinking about how to build something that's going to give you an outcome or a
Mhm.
tangible result versus, I don't know, we threw a bunch of stuff up and we can't tell what worked or
That's
what
right.
didn't. And so is that something like, in addition to offering the product, in order to ensure that your customers are successful, you take time to sort of work with them on, here's how you can think about using this effectively and designing experiments that are really going to have, clear outcomes for you and tell you something about your business?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, setting up that experimentation program and really helping people to understand how to move from point A to point B and maximize the value. I mean, it's good for us, it's good for the customer as well.
Hmm.
And it's important to inculcate that kind of full view of how you would set up a program in order to maximize the outcome. And, it applies to everything. It's not just, having raw experimentation. Like in the area of software development as a whole, the goal is to learn what you don't know as quickly as possible. And that's almost
Right,
more important than shipping features, right?
right.
The more information you can gather, the better off you are in your ability to deliver what matters. And so, this is a super interesting topic in general, what you're running your podcast on, because I think there's so much to glean from that. That if you recast failure, not from not having the desired outcome to what is the level of learning that you're doing at any given time,
Hmm.
it really allows you to promote the idea of value accrual as the ultimate outcome of the learning. The learning is the product and the conversation, being agile in your approach. And I think that's what experimentation is all about at its heart. It's creating the hypothesis that allows you to learn the most from whatever actions you're going to embark on.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, well, now I'm super fascinated, like talking about the product and what you offer and what your
Yeah.
customers do. But, often as an engineering leader, I'm sure like building that culture is harder than just talking about it. And so is there anything that either, within Episerver previously, or that maybe you gleaned from Optimizely as they integrated into the organization? Like, is there anything that really stands out to you about how, the engineering or technology team or R&D overall, however you want to think about it, at Optimizely works, that really embodies that, not just in the tool that you build, but in how everybody sort of shows up every day to get the job done?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, so much of what we do is predicated on having as many sources of information as possible. And so, if we were to limit it just to the software development lifecycle, right? It's not just about passing your unit tests, but it's also about the conversations with the analysts, the conversations with the customers, having the raw analytics of what your customers are doing, having all of the DORA metrics in place, having your actual, stability of the system monitored and everything, and really operating with as much information as you can at any given time. And then operating as bite sized as you can, really getting granular to maximize the outcomes in whatever you're doing. So, it's funny when I think about, the transformation of software engineering, so much of it historically, if you look back 20 years, everything was project based, waterfall to
Hmm.
agile, right?
Hmm.
And so you wanted to maximize the outcome for a given unit of work that was months. And the shift in software development as a whole and what we try to embrace is how can you maximize the outcome for a short period rather than maximizing what you can fit into a period. It's how can you minimize the period in order to get some
Hmm.
sort of outcome. What can you chop off? What is the actual minimum viable? And I think living and breathing that on a daily basis and then really like zeroing in on what are the things that have outsized outcomes for both ourselves as well as our customers is really kind of the DNA of affecting large outcomes.
And I think that the the thing that's in there for me that sometimes gets lost is this, yes, like shrinking the cycle time, smaller batch sizes, kind of all these words that we use quite
Right.
regularly. The thing that I think gets lost, and you said something about this earlier, more important to learn even than to ship features, is like I have 10 features lined up that I could ship, and 9 of them are customers don't even care about, honestly,
Yep.
right? So like the sooner I can find out that they don't care with the smallest possible amount of effort, I've just freed up 9 units of work time, whatever you want to call it, to go build things that they do care about. And so it's
Yeah.
not just that we do things in smaller batches, but we use that feedback constantly to say, oh,
Exactly right.
that's actually not super interesting, but this, like, customers are loving this. How can we get more and more? Like, how can we deliver real value on top of this thing and not put the effort in over here? Which is, it's, yeah, absolutely a great way to think about the overall picture. So you also keep using the expression maximize and like Optimizely for, I don't know what the origin of the name was, but it's clearly about optimization, right? And one thing that I
Right.
really think about a lot is kind of local versus global maximums.
Mm.
Like, you could take a thing you put out and tweak it, right? I'm changing the button color and I'm changing the text around it, and sort of like, I want to think those were the original use cases that I remember with Optimizely, like without even
Mm.
involving engineering. We could change this little thing on the page or whatever. But do you have to think a little bit differently, or start thinking about using the product differently or delivering differently to go find the global? Like, this is all interesting over here, but actually over here, if we take a really, really big, different view of the problem, we can do something fundamentally different that's going to kind of blow customers' minds versus, 3% more people are clicking because we
Right.
changed the name on the button or something like that.
Well, this is, yeah, it's super fascinating when you start looking at how can you make assumptions on your hypothesis? How can you measure outcomes of your hypothesis before you even get there? So there's kind of two avenues here. One is iterative development. I'll circle back to that in a second. But I don't know, Rob, have you ever heard the term painted door?
I
No.
mean,
Okay.
my door has paint on it, but I don't think that's what you're asking me about. Yeah.
No, this is one of my favorite concepts, really. So, as software engineers, we are typically thinking in terms of I've got to go build a thing in order to figure out if it has value. I've got to go
Mm-hmm.
actually have some sort of minimum viable product. The core concept behind a painted door is you can put a button on your website that doesn't work. So, we have a
Mm-hmm.
customer, for example, that wanted to determine what their uplift would be in using Apple Pay. Prior to developing anything around Apple Pay, they went ahead and just added a Pay with Apple Pay button. And when you clicked it, it just said coming soon. But they could
Mm-hmm.
get that direct insight into how many of their customers wanted to use Apple Pay, how many of their customers would use Apple Pay instead of something else, how many of their customers this was actually a blocker and increase their conversion rate or average cart size or whatever else. And being able to experiment with a visual element, but on a complicated process in order to just head off as much as you can about that is an incredibly important kind of lesson to learn. And there's so many places that we can apply this to. If I knew this, then what would I do? As opposed to
Mm-hmm.
building it in order to find out. The second part is as you go into the development cycle, you want to chop it off. So in the Apple Pay example, there's a whole lot of legal, there's a whole lot of development cycles that have to go into wiring this up and making it a thing, right? And instrumenting your code not only to measure the outcomes of each of those steps, but also to enable you to make changes on the fly in what's happening. So this is the fundamental change from feature flag or from web surface experimentation, which is what the web experimentation product Optimizely does, over to feature flag experimentation, where you can actually have branching logic in your code that's centrally maintained, but then
Mm-hmm.
apply statistical models to the outcomes and measure your metrics in a lot more depth. That allows you to get really deep into not just doing rollouts or canary tests, but really to measure the outcome of what could be each line of code. So I think the combination of both really allows you to manage the scope, even when you're talking about very complex systems.
Yeah, I love that kind of build up all the way from the beginning. And so I've never heard I appreciate the expression because I've described the model, and I love having names for things. And
Yeah,
I will unabashedly own up to putting buttons on sites that don't go anywhere, and just like, we would just throw 500s, say, oh,
it's a
something went
great
wrong.
technique.
Sorry,
That's
But
right.
even landing pages. So starting out a new business or a new project, just throwing up landing pages and say, like, seeing what people, if anyone gives you their information, like coming soon,
That's right.
right? And if
Right.
no one signs up, you could save yourself an entire business, not being built, sort of thing. So I think that whole approach to getting started is great, and learning as quickly as possible, and then as you're describing, building on top of it and just
Right.
extending out and extending out. Do you think, I can't remember what book I took this from. It's been quite a while, but this whole notion of consistency principle, like as humans, once we've sort of said something is going to be true or something, we take a position or an opinion, it's really hard for us to back out of that. Does that play into, folks' ability to do things like that? Like, and I'll say we champion the entrepreneur who like stuck to their guns and, went with something and, because no one believed them, but ultimately they were right, and when in reality, many of those folks are ultimately wrong and we just never hear about it. Like, what will it take for us to kind of break that mentality and say, you know what, it's totally fine. We have no idea, but we're going to experiment our way there, versus like, you have to have this singular vision. It's the only way to succeed.
It's really hard. I'll be honest. I face this in my career all the time, and how I address problems. I'll become emotionally invested in the solution space or in a thought process around something.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that I've found with any resiliency to actually get past that is to explicitly ask myself and ask people around me, am I responding to this in an emotional way, or am I incorporating the knowledge that we're gaining with each passing day? We should constantly be reevaluating our fundamental, bedrock of what we build our hypotheses on, because it changes. Even if you are right a year ago, you may not be right today.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
entire environment changes. The economic landscape today is totally different than a year ago. And there's a certain level of insanity in just saying that, I validated this previously and therefore it's correct in perpetuity.
Yes. I think that's a really interesting thing is exactly that. Like, how do you checkpoint and say, we're continuing down this path because we believe this to be true when we started,
Right.
but now we're further along. Are we still doing the right thing? Like, so I almost feel like you would have to build that in up front and say, every month, every week, depending on the size of the thing that you're working on, like, we're going to stop and say, yeah, we believed that to be true. We had evidence that it was true then, but things change quickly, right?
That's
So,
right.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, like, because you're talking about the market shifting, like, I'm just thinking about someone saying, well, these were good investments in my stock portfolio a year ago, therefore I'm going to hang on to all of them, for the rest of time. Like, things change.
Yeah.
What new information do I have? How do I reevaluate how I'm thinking about what we're doing? I mean, do you have a good practice for that? Does it have to be something you look at up front and like really build in, or do you sort of build a
So I
culture
think,
where that's something that works well?
yeah, there's a couple of different approaches, and there's so many different angles that factor into this as well. Your conversation about local minima and maxima factors in as well. I mean, even if we did constantly go and reevaluate our fundamental hypotheses against new data, we would still you want to collect new data on top of that. You want to collect new
Mhm.
metrics. You want to be able to make better informed decisions over time. And so that learning has to be at the root of the organization. That's really what an experimentation culture is all about. So I think that there are a couple of avenues. One is we tend to adhere to the principle of strong opinions loosely held. I'm going to enter a room with my preconceived notions, with whatever the data has told me in the past. But the moment I'm presented with something else, I should be willing to change my view. And this is
Mhm.
something that we hold ourselves to as a principle. So the second part is really embracing failure. And the way that you embrace failure, it's something that's talked about frequently, but the way that I've found it critical to embrace failure is to make failure cheap. You
Mm.
don't want to be hurt by wrong decisions. And a failure is can then be split into two categories. There are failures that you learn from, which are not failures at all because they are cheap. You have gained knowledge, you have gained something by this exchange. And then there are the failures that you don't learn from or you don't learn from quickly enough. And those actually are the failures that you should be concerned about. And the fix for those failures is the organizational approach. How do we make it so that our failures are cheap and we learn from them rapidly? And you have to do it the hard way. There's no easy way to do it. You have to embrace this as a culture, as a principle within the organization in order to have the rapid turnaround and make the most of those situations as they unfold.
Yeah, I think that cost structure, that mental model around cost is super valuable, and whether it's whatever it is that you're learning, right? I mean, even I don't spend a lot of time writing software anymore, which is probably for the best for everyone. But if I'm just writing a document to capture some thoughts or putting together a presentation or something, it's always here's 5 bullet points of the general idea that we discussed. Am I getting this right? Before I spend a day or 2 days writing prose 3 pages long, like, are we on the same page still, right? And just that constant, oh, okay, I'll adjust. It's super cheap, right? It took me a minute. Sometimes I feel bad showing it to people, right? I'm like, there's some
Right.
typos, whatever. But it doesn't matter, because the goal is to course correct and get to the right thing as quickly as possible. And so I feel like that's percolated or perpetuated into other parts of what I do, and just like, what's the smallest thing that I can do that's going to get me feedback and new information in case I'm wrong. If I'm not, then I can keep going and sort of build on top of it. And I think
Right.
that absolutely, that's how we think about product. It's how we think about marketing. Like the tools, can be applied in many, many different ways. So one thing I'm really curious about, on the journey of the company, and I think this is common to a lot of folks, is, you go from probably serving small companies, startups in the early days, and they're like, sure, we'll try anything. We don't even know what our business is yet. And so like entrepreneurs starting companies totally get experimentation. Like that's how they live and breathe. But as you grow and your revenue demands get bigger and your customers get bigger, have you seen a shift in sort of the mentality of your customers who are maybe like, I have a big brand and reputation to protect, and I have to do things in a very buttoned up way? Like, does that change as you get into larger parts of the market? Or are those larger companies now starting to come around to, oh, I can test things cheaply, and that's actually really valuable for me, and I can maybe do it in a test market or something? Like, how has that shifted as you've grown in customer size?
Yeah, actually, what we found is that the larger enterprise customers actually are much more willing to embrace experimentation as a
Oh,
fundamental
wow.
philosophy. It's really interesting. I think that the smaller, your startups and whatnot, they embrace experimentation as a way of life,
Mm-hmm.
but that comes from a place of necessity, right? They
Mm-hmm.
have to react quickly because they only have so much runway. Your large customers, on the other hand, take a different approach. It takes significant effort to move your revenues by 1% when you have
Mm-hmm.
$1 billion of revenues.
Right.
And so being able to test as many different methods of approaching that problem space as possible and be assured of mutual exclusivity and be assured that you're impacting your customers in a positive way, being able to turn those things back off or on at a whim, all of that allows for an accountability and auditability that is really second nature to your enterprise customers. And then
Mm-hmm.
there's also the program management piece. How do you structure your ability to go and execute quickly in a way that allows you to work together more harmoniously? And I think that having a proper experimentation culture is becoming more and more the norm in how we want to converse with our customers, how we want to release our software, how we want to learn as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So definitely at the enterprise space, we're seeing significant adoption. I think it's the enterprises are more willing to make the investment in the
Right.
culture and the approach in order to maximize the outcome.
Right. Right. Makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's a as you're describing, like, how do I move my revenue by 1%, even, is like a very, very daunting space when
Yeah,
your revenues are massive. And so it probably takes a different approach, but the acknowledgement that that's necessary is absolutely there, and probably fun to be part of that conversation as folks are trying to figure out, like, wow, I have a really stable business, but it's not going to get me there. Where do I go? What do I probe?
that's right.
What do I try to figure out how to keep moving? Awesome. So, as a transition, I'm very excited for this piece. Like clearly you're somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about how to learn from things that didn't go to plan. So the red build rewind, can you tell me about a time that, maybe felt catastrophic in terms of something
Yeah.
that didn't go the way that you expected, but ended up teaching you something useful that you've carried and been able to apply somewhere else or many places?
Yeah, it's funny. As I was structuring my thoughts around this and the Red Build Rewind, and what was a good thing to call out. I think the natural inclination is always to talk about, we launched a product and the build went down and we had this massive outage, or we had a security snafu and we leaked PII or something. Those sorts of things happen, right? You do your
Mm-hmm.
best as an engineer to protect yourself from them. But really, I firmly believe that those failures are only failures if you're not learning from them. Uh, yeah, there are varying costs to any of those types of failures. But
Mm-hmm.
looping back to kind of what I was trying to cover, making failure cheap is the way from that. So uh, the specific example that I was thinking about in my career is there are a number of times when I've been working on more legacy oriented products, and when you look at that as a newcomer to the product, or as someone who's been with the product for a very long time, you look at it and you say there's so much that we could do if we shifted the architecture in these meaningful ways, right? It
Mm-hmm.
would unlock so much potential. And frequently, as an engineer, as I've grown, I've tried to mature past this, but it's still my natural inclination. I want to go build a bridge. I want to go build the tank. I want to go build something massive that people look at and they say, that's crazy that you built that, right? That's what we
Mm-hmm.
want to do as engineers. Uh, but stepping back from that and finding the evolutionary path that forces you to checkpoint frequently with your audience, forces you to checkpoint frequently with your paying customers,
Mm-hmm.
is the way around that. And it's been a lifelong battle for me to really zero in and make sure that, whatever your minimum viable is, make it dumber and make
Yeah.
it simpler so you can get those feedback cycles. You used an example in one of the previous calls of, can you do this in Google Docs? If you
Yeah.
can, then do that instead of building something. And I
Yeah.
love that because that's the mentality. There's always a dumber way to take something, and as much information as you can get out of it at each step, and then learn from it and refine and go deeper. That's the approach, and that's how you turn a failure into a success. So by far, my failures have all been because something was misscoped, you wind up overextended, and now you've got to burn it to the ground for the next year, and you're dark, and you're not giving your customers what they wanted. That's where my
Yeah.
failures have.
Was there a bridge or tank that you wanted to build recently? Like, I mean, because you're saying this, and I'm
Oh,
like, yep,
always,
yep. I'm going through this checklist in my
always,
head. So,
always.
is there one that you can give us a little bit of detail on that?
Yeah, I
You
mean, the
know,
standard is always we want to do micro front ends or
mm,
microservices or whatever. We want to build better capabilities for our customers. We want to rebuild our entire API layer. There are examples in all of our products, and I'm sure in CircleCI these are continuous conversations. We've got this
yeah,
tech debt in this area, and we want to go and rebuild it. And I think making that a more iterative approach is difficult. And that's really, I think, the mark of engineering leadership, is to figure out how you advance on those tech debt areas and advance your architecture while not going dark on features. So, as an example, right now we're in the process of rebuilding the experimentation data pipeline over to Google,
mm,
to modernize the whole infrastructure and everything. And rather than doing it as a one and done, we're going to go and rebuild the entire world all at once, as I would have done on any number of previous projects. Starting with your ingest and splitting that into two pipes so that you can start evaluating the outcomes
mm.
and measuring against the two of them in real time. Those sorts of patterns and practices just become much more obvious, that you have to invest the 10% more in order to avoid the 80% worse.
Yeah. I love that space, I guess. And I was gonna ask if you have any good references because I've had this feeling lately that designing systems for that type of evolution is not well understood in our industry. Like there's a I'll call it a canon, which is probably wrong because it's not actually documented by the whole point. But like there's this like knowledge base that exists across individuals, but I actually don't know of any great people out there talking about like what those patterns are. And I think we kind of know what the patterns are. Like what you're describing, like I'm splitting the ingest, I'm going two different ways and validating that this thing is still working before I turn off this other one, whatever. But I feel like everyone's inventing that in their own shops. As a wrap up, do you have any good places that you would recommend people go learn like architectural approaches to dealing with this kind of incremental evolution?
Yeah, so I'm going to completely draw a blank on where to look, but one example is Martin Fowler has this refactoring to patterns
Mm.
book, and like those kind of standard documents are really critical. You know, you're taking your facade patterns and applying it to your project that's in flight, or taking your pipeline design and refactoring. And a lot of those problem spaces really haven't changed in the last 50 years, right? You've got data
Yeah.
pipelines, you've got data storage, and you've got data access, and that's the majority of it. And so taking those standard principles and patterns and practices and making sure to apply them to your products, as opposed to we're just going to go and rebuild and we'll
Mm.
validate based on outputs, is really important. Um, it's interesting though, you know, I'm a computer engineer. So when I went into college, there was basically two choices that they lay out in front of me. There's computer science, and there's computer engineering, right?
Mm.
Computer
Mm-hmm.
science is how do you build it the best way possible. Computer engineering is I want to build the damn thing. So of course I went to
Mm.
computer engineering. And so a lot of this is hard-won battles, as you point out. You
Yeah.
know, having that the cargo cult of knowledge and kind of knowing what to apply at any given point in time. But definitely going out and reading about refactoring in its basic principles is where I would start, were I to embark on the journey again.
Yeah, I think that's totally valid. I think the gap in my mind is like I want a 2020 update of like refactoring your services as opposed to refactoring,
Mm,
your code base. Like I think the problem is people make the same leap I'm making, that is like for some reason it would be different when all we've really done is turned function calls into API calls over the network. Like it's still the same
yeah.
set of goals, principles. So yes, absolutely, children listening to this, go dig up Martin Fowler's refactoring and start with that. Maybe Feathers working with legacy code, or I forget exactly the
Right.
title of that book, but like it all still applies. It all still
It
applies.
does.
Build that foundation of knowledge, and you'll be ready to take on the services. It'll be the same thing.
There's
Awesome.
nothing
Well,
new in the world, Rob.
we do our best to make it that way, though, to make it feel like it's all new, right?
That's right.
Cool. Well, Aniel, thank you so much for joining me. This has been amazing. Love your perspective on experimentation. I'm a big fan of Optimizely. I'm a big fan of hypotheses and just moving fast and learning and, finding the right path instead of keeping going down the wrong path. So appreciate all of that. Thanks to everyone who's listening. Hope you enjoy this. If if you like what we do, you want to hear us talk to someone in particular about something in particular, find us on Twitter at CircleCI. And please subscribe on your podcast provider of choice. Aniel, thanks again for joining me. It's awesome.
Thank you, Rob. It was a pleasure.